Hello and welcome to part 2 of Let's Learn Blender. In this video, we'll be looking into Blender's user interface. I'll be giving you a tour, as it were, of the different areas on screen called editors, how you can customize Blender, and where just about everything you need to know just sort of is as you're getting started into Blender. Also, I'll be going into Blender's user preferences and showing you a couple of options that you should probably change right off the bat. If you're new to my channel, my name is Colin. I'm a high school computer science and digital media teacher, and I've been leading creative technology summer camps in coding, movie making, video game design, and animation, including Blender, since 2006. And as of right now, you can find video tutorials on how to use both Blender as well as the Godot game engine on my channel here on YouTube. But let's go ahead and jump in and talk about Blender. When you start Blender, what you see on screen below the top menu bar is a collection of areas called editors. The top menu bar is almost always on screen, and it contains basic functions like, of course, a file menu with open and save. There's also a render menu with render image and render animation when you want to actually have Blender process your final frames of your animation with lighting and shadows and things like that. That's what it means to render. There's also a sequence of tabs for workspaces. These are different layouts in Blender which actually organize the layout of editors on the screen. We'll talk about these more in a few moments. On the top right of the screen is what's called the outliner editor. The outliner is essentially a list of items in your scene. So by default, I have a cube, a camera, and a light in my scene. So you can see those items listed here. This outliner is structured in a tree format. So when you have an object that's a parent object of another object, its child, we'll get to that more in a future video, you can collapse with these little arrows the parent and all of its children into one kind of row in this list. The outliner is also a place where you can create and organize objects into collections. By default, there is one collection. On the right side of this outliner editor is a row of little eye icons, and this is how you can show or hide any object from your scene. And a recent addition to Blender's outliner is this little filter button where you can enable or disable features of the outliner. If I enable this little camera icon, it'll show that little camera icon next to each object. And if I turn that off or on, well, if it's off, that object, in this case the cube, won't show up in my final render. So that's how you can hide objects from a render. Below the outliner is what's called the properties editor. And you can see here there is a column of tabs along the side. These are for different sections of properties of either your project or your scene in your world or properties of an object. You can see up in the almost the top tab, there is the render settings options. There's also output options if you want to change the resolution of your renders, perhaps the start and end frames or the frame rate or how and where you're outputting to on your computer. There are options for your scene, including units. So if you want to change your scene from being measured in the metric system and meters to Imperial and feet, you can do that, but I'll leave it at metric. Under the world settings, you will find the color of your background. So if I want to change the sky color in my scene, I can click on this little color picker right there. That's what a color picker looks like in Blender. There are basic object properties, modifiers, particle settings if you want to create something like rain or snow or hair. There are physics properties, so if you want to make a rigid body physics simulation or perhaps turn something into a cloth object and have it simulate like cloth or like a fluid domain, you can do that. There are object constraints, so if you want to create, let's say, a mechanical setup, this is where you would put constraints on one object to be attached or follow along or rotate with another object. And of course, there are material properties for the selected object, and there is a tab for textures. By the way, if I go into my output settings properties right here, you can see that with any of these value boxes, like I'll use frame end here, so this is how long my animation will be when I render it out to my computer, I can use any one of these value boxes that has a number in it, and if I click in it, of course I can type a new number in there, but I can also use these boxes, these value boxes, to do math. So if I type in here, if I know I want my animation to be, let's say, 12 seconds long, and I know that my frame rate is 24 frames per second, I can type 12 asterisk, which is times, and 24, and press enter, and it does the math for me. 288 frames in duration, okay? At the very bottom of Blender's interface is what's called the status bar, and in the left side of the status bar, it shows you what you can currently do with your mouse based on where your mouse is in Blender, in what editor your mouse cursor is, as well as what mode you're in and with what object that you have selected. So as you can see right now, it's telling me I can change the frame in my timeline because my mouse cursor is in my timeline. It'll change when my mouse cursor is up in the 3D viewport. It'll also tell me that I can box select because I have the selection tool, the box selection tool enabled, and I can right click to use the object context menu. I'll talk about that in a moment. On the right side of the status bar is information about your current scene as well as Blender itself on your computer. If you right click in the status bar, you can enable or disable these features. It'll tell you scene stats, like how many polygons or triangles you have in your scene, how much memory and video memory that Blender is currently using, as well as the current version of Blender. Above the status bar is the Timeline Editor, and this is the easiest place in Blender to create animation and keyframes, as well as to play back your animation and perhaps your physics simulations if you have a physics simulation. Now, I'm going to do a much more in-depth video on getting into animation in Blender, but if I turn on this round record button and then I click and drag the playhead and put the playhead on a certain frame, with this round record button enabled, if I move an object or transform it in any way, move, rotate, or scale, well, if I have this record button enabled, it will, when I transform an object, create a keyframe, and that's what a keyframe looks like. So now my cube knows to be right here on frame 1. I can grab this playhead from the top and not from the little skinny part of it, put it at 1 second later, which is 24 frames later, at 24 frames per second. I can move the cube over to a different spot. I have a second keyframe now telling the cube to be at this location at this time. So now if I press the go back to the beginning button and then press play, hey, I've got animation. Next up is the 3D Viewport Editor. The 3D Viewport Editor, like other wider editors on your screen, has side panels. Of course, the most obvious side panel is over on the left. This is called the toolbar, but there is a hidden side panel on the right side of the 3D Viewport Editor as well. If I want to show that, well, I can click on one of these little arrows that's just kind of hidden and tucked off over to the side. If I click this little arrow, it'll pop out. But of course, being Blender, there are keyboard shortcuts to show and hide these panels. This side properties panel, which by the way shows you properties of your currently selected item, there's tabs, and the currently selected tool properties as well as the view properties. But if I want to hide this or show this panel quickly, I can press the letter N on my keyboard with my mouse cursor in the 3D Viewport Editor. And if I want to hide or show the tool shelf, I can press T for tool shelf. So T and N. I'm not sure why N is properties panel, but there you go. Along the top of the 3D Viewport Editor is a tool settings bar that'll show you common properties of the tool that you currently have selected. So if I have the move tool selected, it'll show me options for the move tool. Not all settings for every tool fit up in this top toolbar. So over in the properties editor, there is the first tab, which will show you all the settings for that tool. Also, when you right-click in the 3D Viewport Editor, you will get what's called the Object Context menu. In older versions of Blender, you would get to this by pressing the W key on your keyboard, and it was called the Specials menu way back when. But the Object Context menu, it gives you common options for the object that you have selected based on what mode you're currently in on that object. By the way, when you have a mesh object selected, or really any object, there is this mode menu, and with mesh objects, if you want to get into, say, modeling and sculpting that object, well, this is where you go. You select that object, you go up to the mode menu, you can switch from object mode to edit mode or sculpt mode, or of course there are other modes as well. If you select a different kind of object, there are different modes for different kinds of objects. Speaking of different kinds of objects, if I go ahead and select my 3D cube and I press either the letter X on my keyboard or the delete key on my keyboard, and I press delete, that's how you can delete, and I go up to the add menu and add a different kind of mesh. Let's say I want to add a UV sphere. Well, when you add a mesh into your scene, I often get the question on YouTube, how do you change that mesh object's properties, like how do you change the number of faces or rings or loops on it? Well, that option is only available right when you first add a mesh, and those options are down here in what's called a little popover. If you expand this popover up, this popover will actually show you the options for the last operation that you performed in your scene. So the last thing I did was add a UV sphere. So now I can change the number of segments on this UV sphere, the number of rings and the radius, and of course the location and rotation. If I, however, do something else, perform a different operation like move, well, the last operation in my scene was then move, and I can't go back and edit the properties of what I just did because now they're gone. The 3D viewport itself has 4 viewport shading modes. I'm going to go ahead and hide with the N key that side properties panel. The 3D viewport has 4 viewport shading modes, which include wireframe mode, so you can see your scene in wireframe. There is solid viewport shading mode, which is the default. This does not show colors and materials on objects, so everything's going to be gray pretty much most of the time. There is also material preview viewport shading mode, which of course shows materials in a kind of a preview mode with nice sort of even lighting. And finally, there is rendered viewport shading, which actually renders your viewport in real time. And this is pretty remarkable because it is actually calculating shadows and lighting right in the viewport, even if you change your viewport's view or you change something in your scene. There are options for all of these shading modes in this little arrow popover right here. So if you are in material preview viewport shading mode and you go to this menu, you'll be able to change things like the lighting based on an HDRI image that's projecting light onto your scene. So if you change that option, you will see a different color and different properties of light that's hitting everything in your scene. Also, there are 2 buttons up next to these viewport shading modes, which can hide all the gizmos in your viewport, including all these side buttons. That's this button right here. You can also click next to it to enable or disable any of these. There is also a overlay button, which if you press it, it'll hide pretty much everything, and I can turn everything, including gizmos, off right there. So now I can see my scene with less obstruction. Of course, with overlays, I can turn any of them on or off. One of the questions I often get is, how do you fix the problem in Blender's viewport when you zoom into an object, and if you get too close to an object, well, what happens is it'll start to do what's called clipping. And clipping means it doesn't show objects that are too close to your view in your viewport. Likewise, if you zoom too far out from an object, well, you can see I can't see my cube anymore. How do you fix this? Well, this is under properties of this viewport, which of course I can bring up with the N key. That's the properties side panel. I can go to view, and I've turned these properties up called clip start and clip end to exaggerate this. But if your scene is of a larger or perhaps a smaller scale, you might notice this more. But if I change these clip start and clip end values, well, I can bring objects back. So I'll change this to maybe 5,000 meters, and there we go. I can see more of my scene, and I might turn this down to 0.001 meters so I can see things that are really close up. Okay, so these are the editors in the default arrangement of your screen when you first start Blender up. But one of the beautiful things about Blender, again, is that you can customize your interface a whole lot in terms of the layout of these editors. The easiest way to do that is to use the default sequence of workspaces via these tabs at the top. So if I'm just laying things out in Blender and putting objects in my scene, this is not a bad layout of editors or areas on my screen. But if I want to focus on an object and spend some time modeling that object, I might use the modeling workspace, which gets rid of my timeline, because I probably don't need to animate with a timeline when I'm modeling an object. There's also sculpting mode. So if I'm in this mode and perhaps I want to sculpt something, I can do that. There's UV editing for adding textures like image textures onto objects. This sequence of workspaces roughly follows the progression of how you would complete a 3D animation, if that's what you're creating in Blender. But that is not the only way with this layout and these sequence of tabs. This isn't the only way you can start up Blender. If I go to File and New, well, I can choose a new general file, and I'll click Don't Save. This is the default in Blender, what you've seen so far. But if I want to focus more on 2D animation, well, I might want to start Blender out like this, with a different layout of areas or editors on screen, as well as a different sequence of workspaces. I can also go up to File, New, and choose a new sculpting project. I'll click Don't Save. If I want to sculpt something, well, you know, there we go. And I can go to File, New, and create a new visual effects VFX file or a video editing file. Yes, Blender has a video editor built right in. One of the great things I can do as well is I can actually customize any of these presets if I want to tweak how they start up with Blender. So if I'm in this general file type and I don't want it to start up with a cube every time, so I will select it and press X and delete, and I'll go up to the Add menu and I'll add a monkey, because maybe I want the scene to start off zoomed in on a monkey head every time. Well, what I can do is I can go now to File, and then I'll go down to Defaults, and I'll say Save Startup File. And what that will do is it'll update the new general file layout with the current way that I have Blender right now. So I'll click again, Save Startup File, and now if I actually close Blender and say Don't Save, and then I go back to my taskbar and open Blender back up, now I'm zoomed in on a monkey head. If I want to undo that or go back to the factory settings, it's File and Defaults and Load Factory Settings and click to confirm. And now that everything is back to the default, I need to set this as the new startup file. So I'll go to File and Defaults and Save Startup File. That will save the factory settings as the startup file, and click to confirm. So now if I close Blender and then open it back up again, you can see that Blender is back to the factory settings. Blender also lets me change the type of editor in any one of the areas on the screen. All editors have what's called a header bar along their top, and every header bar has the same button on the very far left-hand side, where if you click it, it'll give you the option to change that editor into any other editor type. So if I want my outliner on screen, maybe I don't want it up here, well, I can change this editor type from an outliner into another 3D viewport. So now I have another small 3D viewport up here, and maybe I don't need a properties editor right now. Maybe I want this to be a taller outliner. Well, I can change the properties editor right here into an outliner. So really, it's that easy. But it goes even further, because I can actually split editor areas in half, which means I can create my own layout. If I put my mouse cursor in the corner, any corner of any of the editors on screen, except of course the top bar and probably even the status bar at the bottom, you will see that with my mouse cursor in the corner of an editor, it turns into a little plus or cross. When it's like this, I can drag either horizontally or vertically with left click and drag into the center or towards the center of that editor. And when I do this, you can see I'll left click and drag. It splits an editor into two, and now I'm free to use these independently, or perhaps I can even change one of their types. If I want to change this right one into, let's say, a shader editor, I can do that. Or even I could have, I'll change this back to a 3D viewport. I can split again this editor in half up and down. So I'll grab the corner and click and drag, and now I can have 4 or even 5 3D editors up on the screen at the same time. Likewise, I can join editors that are next to one another and that form a rectangle on screen together. If I put my mouse in the corner of an editor next to another editor that I want to join it with, well, I can do that, and I can click and drag up into the other one, and you'll see that arrow. And if I let go, it'll merge those two. Again, you have to merge editors that are next to one another that form a rectangle. So I could not merge this large editor with this one right here, because these two form an L shape and not one whole common side. So I'll go ahead and merge these two together. And as you can see, if I click and drag from the corner, I can choose which direction it goes, up or down, taking over one or the other. I'll go ahead and merge these together, turn this back to a properties editor and this back into an outliner. Something else I can do is I can actually swap two areas around, and I just actually learned this one for myself fairly recently. If I hold the control key on my keyboard and I put my mouse cursor in the corner of an editor next to another one, well, if I do that, hold control, and I click and drag into another editor and let go, they will swap spots. So now I have my properties editor up top and my outliner below. I'll go ahead and swap them back. I'll hold Control and left click and drag from a corner. And as you can see, again, that swaps them around. If I want to take an editor and pop it out into its own separate window, well, I can hold Shift and do the same thing. I can hold Shift, click on a corner and drag outwards. And hey, now I have a second or another window that I can maybe move into a second monitor on my computer. And then maybe I can turn this 3D editor into a viewport for my rendered. So I'll go to rendered view and look through my camera. That might be handy. Lastly, if you don't know where something is in Blender and you're looking for it and you wish that Blender had a search option, well, it does. You press the function or F3 button on your keyboard. If you press F3 on the top row of your keyboard, you get the search box. And so if I want to search for how to duplicate my currently selected default cube, well, I can type in duplicate. And now I can see, well, duplicate objects is found under object, and I could just click on it here to duplicate my cube. Or now that I know that it's under object, and well, hey, there's an object menu right here, I can just press escape on my keyboard, go up to object, and I can find duplicate object right there. So if I click that and move my mouse, hey, I've got a duplicated object grabbed, and now I can click to place it. Lastly, Blender's preferences. I promised you at the beginning of this video that I'd show you a few settings in Blender's preferences that you might want to change right away. So in Blender, if I go up to the edit menu, I can go down to preferences and that'll pop up the preferences window in Blender. There are tabs along the side that categorize Blender's preferences into sort of categories. Starting off with interface, if you're like me and you want Blender to have bigger buttons and icons on the screen and just make everything bigger, you can change the resolution scale. For the sake of these videos, I've changed mine from the default 1.00, that's the normal size where everything is just smaller. I've turned everything up to 1.25. By the way, Blender's preferences now auto-save, so anytime you change something and then you close this window, well, you don't have to worry about going down to this menu and saying save. It auto-saves by default, okay? If you want to change Blender's theme, the color scheme, you can go down to themes, where you can then change Blender to one of the presets. So if I want to make Blender look like Maya, well, I can do that. I'll stick with Blender Dark. In this theme section though, you can change any of the colors pretty much in Blender's interface. So you can really dig into here and change the color, let's say, of the lines of your ground grid floor in your 3D viewport if you want. That's up to you. In Viewport, what you might want to change if you're having a hard time selecting gizmos in your 3D viewport, I have found that if I have the rotate gizmo selected and I'm trying to rotate an object on some computers in Blender, it's just hard to, when you put your mouse over it, grab and rotate that object because it's not detecting that you're actually clicking on the gizmo. If that is a problem for you, then you might want to go into, under Viewport, the selection area and turn off or on this OpenGL depth picking option. That has helped for me in the past. Up under the editing section in 3D Cursor, I often suggest users turn off Cursor Surface Project. If I have that turned on and I'm moving my 3D cursor around, I'll use my 3D cursor tool and now I can click to place the 3D cursor in my scene. Well, if I click on a mesh, that 3D cursor with that default option will kind of stick to the outside of objects. Sometimes I want to put the 3D cursor inside of a mesh. If I am, say, changing where its origin is, I'll put the origin to the location of the 3D cursor, but I want that to be inside of an object. So what I can do is I can turn off Cursor Surface Project under editing. And so now I will press Shift S on my keyboard, which is the keyboard shortcut for the snap menu I showed you in the first video in this series. I can now select after Shift S cursor to world origin. And so now if I click on a mesh, you can see that the 3D cursor did not jump to the front visible surface of that mesh. So that is really handy. You might want to do that. Under animation, if you want to be able to add keyframes of an animation before frame 0 of your timeline, you can enable this option, allow negative frames. Under the input section, if your computer's keyboard does not have a numpad at the right side, that means it's not an extended keyboard like the one pictured on screen now, you might want to enable the numpad option or enable numpad in this section, which will make your number row at the top of your keyboard act like the numpad. So if you press the one key in your number row with this option enabled, it will go to the front view in your 3D viewport. That's kind of a nice thing to have, but you should know that enabling this option gets rid of the default keyboard shortcuts that are accessed when you press the number row keys on your keyboard, but you might want to access those view keyboard shortcuts for front, side, top, etc. instead. If your mouse does not have a mouse wheel, you might want to enable emulate 3-button mouse, and what this will do is it'll let you press the Alt key on your keyboard and then left click and drag. I'll just demonstrate that now. If I hold Alt, I believe it's the Option key on a Mac, and I left click and drag, I'm orbiting right now with Alt and left click and drag, and that's enabled again if I go to my preferences and turn emulate 3-button mouse on. Speaking of your mouse, if you are a die-hard Blender 2.79 old school user of Blender and you don't like this whole left click to select thing, because older versions of Blender 2.79 and before actually had right click to select in the 3D viewport, if you want to go back to that, well, you can go to the key map section of preferences, and that option is right here. Select with mouse button, left is default in Blender 2.8 and above, and you can switch it to right if you want, and then change options for that here. I'm going to stick with left though, the default. I'm going to go back up one section though to the navigation section, because this setting right here called Orbit Around Selection is probably the most important setting that you need to change right away in Blender's preferences. If you are working in your 3D scene and you're orbiting around, well, there is no guarantee that in your 3D viewport, when you orbit, especially if you're zoomed into an object, that it's going to keep what you're currently working on. Like right now, I have this cube selected. There's no guarantee that it's going to keep that object visible in your viewport, in other words, centered when you orbit. So it might kind of shift over as you orbit around, even if you want to just look at the back of that same object. So I'm going to go back into Blender's preferences and enable that. And what that guarantees is that it keeps whatever you have selected in the very middle of the viewport, and it orbits around that when you change or orbit your view. Lastly, under the save and load section, this is a setting here that you don't need to change, but you should definitely be aware that it's here. Blender by default auto saves whatever you're working on in your currently open copy of Blender. It saves by default every 2 minutes. So if Blender ever crashes, you're not out of luck, but only if you know where to look, because it's not actually going to save your file for you. It's not going to save and update your currently open file. It's going to save a copy of it into a secret temporary folder. And if you know where that is, you can easily recover your work. That folder can be found under file paths. The folder in my case is in my C drive. It's in my users folder, hidden app data in Windows. This folder called app data is hidden. Then inside of a folder called local and temp, if I go there after Blender crashes, or even after I'm just working, I'll find a .blend file with some random name there. That is my current project that maybe I just lost because I hadn't saved for hours and hours and hours. Don't worry, there's a backup. It saves every 2 minutes. And yes, the setting will save your life in Blender. But that will be it for this video on Blender's user interface and a few quick preferences for you to change. As always, I hope this video was helpful. My name is Colin, and if you like this video or if you learned something in it, please go ahead and click that like button below this video. I really appreciate it, and it helps out my channel when you do that. If you want some more videos like this one in Blender or in the Godot game engine or in technology in general, go ahead and click on that subscribe button below and click the bell icon to be notified whenever I upload a new tutorial. Check out my Facebook and Instagram pages. In those places, I post sneak peeks and previews of what I'm working on next, and you can hear from me the most there besides here on my YouTube channel. But that'll be it for this video. Thanks for watching as always. See you in the next one. Bye-bye.